consensus of maybe 200 years of textual criticism on the best text, Greek text of the Gospel of Mark that we have access to. I would say, in all honesty, and there are a lot of scholars who agree with this is not original to me, that what we probably have here is the best text that was in existence in about the year 200. And that's 130, 135 years after the gospel was written. And so when we refer to the autograph, we refer to this reconstruction or construction out of the 4,500 manuscripts that we have. And yet, of course, we can only do that within the limits of what research is able to reproduce. And if we get to 200, what happened in that first, let's say, 135 years is very difficult to say. We can speculate, but it would be pure speculation. But we do know how it changed after that, and if it changed that much after that, then certainly in the earlier period, before this was beginning to be viewed as kind of sacred text or canon or holy scripture or whatever you want to call it, the likelihood is that changes that scribes made were even greater in the early period than they were in the later period. But of course we don't know that. That's purely speculation. And a lot of what I'm going to say today is speculation. Reconstructing 2,000-year-old history with limited resources is not an easy task. We use the word gospel, but the opening words of this book, if you have it in front of you, and of course some of you are going to have different translations. I'll read what I wrote. You probably have at the heading of the page, the Gospel of Mark. You probably have something like that. Well, that was not in the text. That is not in the text. The title, or if you want to call it superscription, is the first verse. And I'm going to read what I wrote, but some of you will have some changes, and I'd be welcome to hear that. And I simply wrote, beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. And I put in parentheses, or Jesus Messiah. Christ was not his last name. Christ is a title. It is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. Do any of you have an additional word or two in your text?
Son of God.
The Son of God, which is not in our oldest manuscripts. Which is not in our oldest manuscript, so I didn't include it. And I comment on it, when I discuss the superscription, but that was added, and it's much easier to understand why someone would have added it, a scribe would have added it, rather than why a scribe would have dropped it. If it was in the original text, why was it dropped? Well, it could be dropped by error, except that early in the copying of a manuscript where you're in the first line, it seems less likely that you would make such a mistake. It's easier to understand why it would be added. And scholars have what they call the criterion of dissimilarity. And that means that what is less likely, the belief of the early church, is probably closer to the original text, because according to this criterion, the church would be more likely to make the text look a bit more like what the church came to believe. And so I did not include that. So the beginning of and do you have the word gospel or good news?
Good news.
Good news?
Good news.
Gospel.
But
Well,
gospel means good spiel. Good.
Gospel actually is an old
speech.
English word, good spiel, good news. And really it should say good news, because gospel was not a literary form at this time. The author of this gospel, the evangelist here, this is our first example of this literary form in Christianity. And it's similar to, in form, to the Greco-Roman biographies of Plutarch and Suetonius, written about the same time. And I say that in the fullest sense of the word, because the Greco-Roman lives were not what we would call history. They were designed to advance some important character, and they are full of exaggeration, fabrication. They are commonplace. And I would say that the gospel here is very much like that. We cannot read this as if it were a history book. We've got to try to understand it for what it is and for what it is not. About 100 years ago, there emerged in New Testament scholarship something that we call form criticism. It originated in Germany out there for my good friends. Formgeschichte is what it was called. The history of literary forms. Ken applauded that. And they identified basically 5 literary forms that we find here in this gospel. And let me just say a little bit about each of these. I'm going to read from my own text here. The first is what is called pronouncement stories. And these generally involve a discussion or a dialogue between Jesus and an opponent in which Jesus resolves the issue with a final statement. And let me show you one. If you have your Bibles there, you might turn to chapter 12. Let's see. Okay, you'll all recognize it. I'm going to read it from my translation, but you'll see what I mean by this literary form. And the scholars have come to understand or believe that what they had was a saying of Jesus, perhaps a saying of Jesus, that was then put into a context, that the form itself, the story itself is created. It doesn't necessarily reflect the specific occasion on which this phrase was spoken. And let's look at this. And I'm going to read my translation, which begins with "and." I don't know, you probably don't have that in your text. "And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians so that they might trap him in what he might say. And they came and said to him, quote, 'Teacher, we know that you are an honest man and that you show deference to no one, for you do not pay attention to outward appearance, but you truly teach the way of God. Is it permitted to pay the poll tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or not?' But knowing their hypocrisy, Jesus said to them, 'Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius so that I might see it.' So they brought it in. So they brought one and said to him, and he said to them, 'Whose image and likeness is this inscription?' So they said to him, 'Caesar's.' So Jesus said to him, 'Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God.' And they were utterly amazed at him." So what the pronouncement is, that final phrase, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." That's the pronouncement. And the story it's suggested, was created probably within the church as a framework to promote this. We have to realize that the gospel came out of the church at a time probably 35 to 40 years after Jesus died. And so the framework is very much reflects the position of the church. So that's the first one of these forms. The second is miracle stories, and I'm not going to tell you what a miracle story is. By the way, there are 21 pronouncement stories in the gospel. You all know what a miracle story is, so I'm not going to read a miracle story, but there are 17 of them in this gospel. The third form is parables, And it usually begins, and the kingdom of God is like, well, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed, and so when it grows up to be the tallest tree, in the world, which isn't really quite true. But that's a parable, and there are 10 parables, and I think you're familiar with them, so I'm not going to bore you with reading a parable. The fourth literary form is sayings, and these are sayings without the context of a pronouncement story. And sometimes individual sayings or clusters of sayings, often on the same subject, and the cluster is gathered in such a way that sometimes it's very awkward in the gospel because there's a saying and then there's kind of a related saying and another saying, as if Jesus spoke all of this at once, but that's not the case. There are 47 individual sayings or clusters of sayings in this gospel. And fifth and last, legends. And legends are exactly what the word suggests, but I'm going to read my text. Legends, or stories about Jesus, report alleged events in the life of Jesus, often surrounded by miraculous or supernatural details. The earliest example is when Jesus is driven out into the wilderness and he has a dialogue with the devil. That would be what we would call a legend. And the implication of a legend is that it purports to be an event, but it's very unlikely that it is an event. You have to understand that I'm an historian, and historians have certain rules about what constitutes a fact, and the implication is that there are either multiple witnesses or eyewitnesses, or you're not too far removed from the event. And so the Gospels are seriously problematic because in spite of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, no contemporary New Testament scholar would maintain that the Gospels were written by those four people. I'll start with Matthew, was one of Jesus' disciples. Mark was a disciple of Peter. Luke was a follower of Paul, and John was a disciple. So the church, by the middle of the 2nd century, began to attribute these anonymous Gospels. The Gospel within the text, there's no claim to authorship in any of the Gospels. Those are all assigned probably beginning by the middle of the 2nd century. When was this Gospel written? Well, I argue in my book sometime between about 66 and 69, sometime after the beginning of the Nero persecution, but probably before the fall of Jerusalem. And that is almost 40 years after Jesus' death. So we are at least a generation or 2 generations removed. Oops, my screen just went out.
Shoot. Oh, that's never happened before.
There we go.
Hello.
Okay. Sorry we were cut off. I think the last thing I said is the gospel was probably written sometime between about 66 and 69. Based on internal evidence, and I have to be very honest with you, the evidence is not overwhelming. We look for a little piece of data there, a little piece of data there, and try to put it together. But that's where scholarship is pretty much Greek. So again, the information, the data is very limited, and we try to draw conclusions from a little piece of evidence here and a little piece of evidence there, and the evidence is not overwhelming. And so I always say we draw our conclusions within limits of historical reason. I think what happened in this gospel is the anonymous author collected already existing oral and largely written traditions into a coherent narrative for his own Christian community to understand the good news of Jesus, Messiah. That opening phrase, by the way, the good news, is this the good news that Jesus was preaching, or is it the good news that the church was preaching? And the interesting thing is that the grammar allows either translation. And so the way I translate it, I don't say the good news about Jesus. I say what the Greek says, the good news of Jesus, Messiah, which shows that subtlety. There's a lot of times in the gospel where there are subtleties and you can't do it in English. You can't carry those subtleties forward, but I try when I can. The Gospels, and by the way, this is the first, what we would call literary form that was then later copied by the author of the Gospel of Matthew and Luke and John. And there were about 20 other Gospels in circulation. Most of you probably don't even know that. These are the four that kind of made the cut. But there were a lot of Gospels around. And Mark, or the evangelist, see I slipped, the evangelist basically created the literary form, as I say, modeled on Greco-Roman histories. The interesting thing in my saying that the author had literary material for him is that there are clusters of pronouncement stories and clusters of parables and clusters of miracle stories. We'll have 3 or 4 or 5 together in the gospel. And I think that suggests, for what it's worth, that he may have had writings where the clusters were already grouped. And he may be, he's providing is the kind of the tissue to create a narrative out of this and make a coherent story. The geography in the gospel is probably useless. He has them going from here to here for the story, and then they walked by the lake, and then they went into the countryside. That's probably all part of the evangelist. You begin to recognize what his language is, and of course I go into some detail about that in the book. Let me ask you now to get out your Bibles and where's the birth narrative? Let's see, where's that in the text?
There is none.
There is none. Oh my goodness. And here we are right next to the Nativity Chapel next door, which I actually had the money to build that originally. Why is there no nativity story?
Good question.
Good question. Does anyone have we only have suggestions. I mean, there are a limited number of suggestions. I would say either he didn't know of a nativity story, he decided not to incorporate it into his gospel, or nativity stories had not circulated in the time when the evangelist was writing.
Are there earlier versions that have a nativity story in them?
Where do we have the nativity stories. I'll give you a clue. The Gospel of John has no nativity story. Matthew and Luke. And look at them. They are totally different stories. The nativity story that you have in mind is a collation of Matthew and Luke. They are two totally different nativity stories. The only similarity is that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, which he probably was not born in Bethlehem. I have to be careful. Here we are in the Christmas season, and I'm expressing some heresies here. That his mother and father were, what did I say? His mother and father were Mary and Joseph. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. And that's about it. The shepherds in the field, the magi, they're in totally different stories. Totally different stories. And if you take a little time and compare them, they're only a chapter or so each, you'll find that. Let's look at a couple of other sections in Mark here to help us better understand. In chapter 3, verse 31. Does anybody want to read that? Who has the text in front of them? And then I'll correct it into the better text. Who's there? Anybody got a Bible there?
I've got the Oxford annotated Bible.
Okay, well, whatever translation that is, probably New Revival. Read it, Jerry.
And his mother and brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside waiting for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking around on those who sat around him, he said, Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.
What is this? Jesus had brothers?
That's what Mark says.
Let's look at chapter 6. The beginning of chapter 6. Do you want to read verses 1 through 3, Jerry? Do you have that in front of you too?
Sure, and he went away from there, and he came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get all this? What is the wisdom given to him? What mighty works are wrought by his hands? Is it not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?"
4 brothers by name, at least 2 sisters. How many of you knew that? You already knew that. What do you make of that?
Well, I make this of it, that sisters is plural in both cases, so there were at least 2 sisters, but they're
Right.
never named because girls were not all that important.
Did most of you know that Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters? Is
My
that
father was a minister.
a little bit strange?
Question.
Yes.
Isn't there a dispute on what they considered brothers and sisters? Like, cousins were considered brothers and sisters, that's what I heard, no?
Do you come out of the Roman Catholic
Yes,
tradition?
I do.
The word Adolphos means brother. Soft word, Philadelphia, it means brother. The Catholic Church in particular, I'm not saying this critically, of course, because they not only believe in the virgin birth, but that Jesus is the only child of Mary. They either assign them as cousins or Joseph's by a previous marriage. Now this is basically creating history to fit theology. Yes?
Arthur, isn't there an immediate power struggle
we're talking about,
Peter goes to
we're talking about
church.
mostly the period after Jesus' death, yes. There was,
Yeah, but I mean, that would be supportive of the notion that he had brothers who were trying to carry on his legacy
oh, yeah.
after.
Well, whatever the reason here, I mean, Mark includes it, there must have been something, but I'm gonna shock you even a little bit more when I tell you, and Jerry, you were reading this in verse 3, is this not the son of the carpenter and of Mary? Who's the carpenter?
Joseph, supposedly.
Joseph, the son of the carpenter. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm reading my own translation. And I'll tell you why. And I here quote from my book. The reading I have rendered, the son of the carpenter rather than the carpenter, is found in the earliest surviving fragments of this verse, in several ancient Greek manuscripts, and in several early translations of the Gospel into Old Latin, the Vulgate Latin, Bohairic Coptic, and Ethiopic. Translations were done already beginning in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And these these translations and our earliest manuscripts say, is this not the son of the carpenter? You will find that in virtually none of your Bibles. And the reason, of course, is to preserve the notion of the virgin birth. Here again, theology is trumping history. And why do we dismiss the earliest texts that we have, the earliest documents that we have, and why do we dismiss these translations, early translations done in the 2nd and 3rd century, which say, was he not the son of the carpenter and Mary? It's theology. Anyway, this is the kind of thing I do in my book. So it's playing with, I don't know the answer. But what we try to do is to draw conclusions based on the best evidence that we have. And as I said earlier, trying to reconstruct events of 2,000 years ago is particularly challenging. Okay, let's do another little game here. I guess you've all heard that Jesus was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures. 1 Corinthians let's see, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 following. Does anybody want to read?
What are those numbers again, 1 Corinthians?
1 Corinthians
What chapter and verse?
chapter 15, verses 3 following. Do I have any volunteers there in the audience?
Sorry, what was
Sure,
it?
read.
Go ahead.
For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12.
Okay, that's far enough. Okay. Interesting. He was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures. This is Paul writing, and he says that this tradition has been handed down. He doesn't actually say what scriptures he's referring to, and he doesn't really describe the details of what happened, but let's look at a few other passages. If Acts is available, turn back a couple of...
Arthur, here's a question over there.
Sure.
Okay, now, the letters of Paul, they've done research. Some of them are written by the same guy, okay? Others are kind of like, this isn't the same guy. Is this one of the ones they think it's original? Or
This is one of the Paul, you're talking about
Yeah.
Paul? Yes, this is one of the genuine Pauline letters,
okay.
in all probability. Yeah. And as you mentioned, although 10 are attributed to Paul, generally 4 are considered Deutero-Pauline, written by some kind of disciple of Paul. Okay, but now we're looking in Acts, in chapter 2, verse 24. And I'll read that. But God raised him, having freed him from death, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. Difficult to know exactly what's being said there, that the power of death could not control Jesus. Let's look a little farther down in that same chapter, verses 32 and 33. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses, being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out that which you both see and hear. Having been exalted. What does exalted mean as opposed to resurrection? What are we dealing with here? Well, let's look down in verse 36. Therefore, let the entire house of Israel know with certainty that God has made him Lord and Messiah. This Jesus whom you crucified. What is the author of Acts saying here in what is probably a very primitive formula? God made him Lord and Messiah when? After his death. After his death. Look at Romans. This is, again, Paul, a genuine Pauline letter. Good question. In chapter 1 of Romans, I'll begin in verse 3. Here's the gospel concerning his son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by resurrection from the dead. Declared to be Son by virtue of his resurrection from the dead. Paul is earlier than any of the Gospels, by the way. 1 Corinthians is probably written in the mid-50s. What is the implication of this here?
Are they still trying to figure out what exactly happened, or it's added new things? You're trying to parcel things out, what really happened, or people are putting things on Jesus that maybe they think happened but not sure, something like that.
Well, I think the implication of this, I think it's quite clear that Jesus' messiahship early on was traced to his resurrection. Or, better, exaltation, because it says death could not contain him. He was raised to the right hand of God. That's the position of authority, raised to the right hand of God. What I see here, even in the text of the New Testament, is the belief that following Jesus' death, someone said there was no way that death could contain Jesus, that the Romans and the Jews could win this victory, but that God exalted him to his right hand to a position of power. Now, what am I saying by that? I'm saying that the resurrection is not a resurrection probably of the body. It is a resurrection that's saying, in modern terms, evil cannot triumph. Ultimately, good triumphs evil. And the way it's expressed in what I would call ancient Hebrew mythology is that God exalted him to his right hand. I think that's the most primitive version of what the church believed happened following Jesus' death.
You say that his word still lives on, they couldn't shut him up, they crucified him, shut him up. This is over with, and all of a sudden,
It's not
what
over.
he's
with.
saying,
Not over.
It's not over.
what's that?
Yeah,
It's not over.
it's not over. And I think, I'm not talking, I don't think we're talking about an event here. We're talking about a belief of the followers of Jesus that the Romans and the Jews could not destroy this man, that ultimately God has the final word, and God exalted him to a position of authority or honor at his right hand.
Question. Textually, you say the Pauline letters are earlier. Were the miracles of his life made up after the exaltation in Paul? Was the life story fitted after Pauline's or Paul's exaltation?
Let's look at Mark then. And maybe this will answer your question. Let's look at Mark 16. See, this is what I really like to do, is to get, I don't have the answers, I wasn't there. But we're playing with the text and we're trying to make sense of the text in its historical context. Mark 16. Shall I just read it? Oh, if I do that, I should read my own translation, shouldn't I?
I mean, I'm happy to read too, I just don't wanna take over. Want me to read? I can-
Mark 16. And when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdala and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought aromatic oils so that they might go and anoint him. It's interesting that this occurs 2 days later, because you're supposed to anoint the body the day of a person's death. And very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb just after the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us?" Here they're going down to anoint the body, and then they realize, of course, these were not very bright women, I guess, so that they couldn't get into the tomb. And when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was extremely large. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, wearing a white robe, and they were astonished. And he said to them, "Do not be astonished. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has been raised." Doesn't say he raised his body. He has been raised. He is not here. Look the place where they put him. But go and say so forth and so on. A man is in the tomb. Look in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. What's the parallel to that? In chapter 28. Who's in the tomb?
Matthew 28?
Matthew 28, verse 5. Actually, you can go back to verse 2. an angel. And the Gospel of Luke, it's two angels. It shows how free the tradition is. Matthew and Luke are assumed, the authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are assumed to have copied from Mark. Virtually all scholars believe that. So what we're reading here is a story for the first time of an empty tomb. And going back to the conversation we had earlier, I think this is now, again, 35 to 40 years removed from the event. I think Mark, or the author of this gospel, the evangelist, for the first time introduces the concept of a resurrected body, that the tomb is empty. Where are the resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark? There are none. There are none. And if you look at the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, you will find in Matthew resurrection appearances in Galilee, and in the Gospel of Luke, resurrection appearances in and around Jerusalem. Totally different stories. Again, like the birth narratives. I think Matthew and Luke had access to tradition, or some created traditions, that elaborated what was in the Gospel of Mark, where there is simply an empty tomb. And I think that is an advancement over the earliest tradition that Jesus, I call it exaltation theology, that evil could not triumph over good, and so God intervened and elevated Jesus to his right hand.
Could I, just to kind of copy what you said too, the gospel writers are mostly copying each other, whereas Paul was written in a different context. So probably, I would think, Arthur, wouldn't you agree that Paul probably didn't influence the gospel writers, even though he was writing before, a little earlier?
It's very difficult to know what they had access to.
Yeah.
Now you have to remember, there was no church in that first 2 or 3 generations. There were little churches, and churches met in houses, in people's houses, very often in the houses of women, widows, but women had a larger role in the church probably in antiquity than it does today. And they met, and they had their own storytelling. Let's face it, people couldn't read and write. People couldn't read and write. And within the context of a church in Corinth, or a church in Rome, or a church in Ephesus, or a church in Alexandria, or a church in Jerusalem, there would be different storytellers. And that should not, in my mind, denigrate the value of the tradition. That to me helps to understand better the tradition and understand that we are dealing with stories that grew up within the church or churches. And as I said, in addition to these 4 Gospels, there are about 15 or 20 more that were circulating by the end of the 2nd century or the early 3rd century. We have some birth narrative, a childhood narrative in the Gospel of Thomas, attributed to Thomas. Jesus' ages, 6 to 12, and he goes around doing miracles at ages 6 to 12 and so forth. That didn't make the cut. And basically, I mean, who decided?
This is it.
What's in the Bible? Who decided that?
Church.
Yeah, men. I would say it was probably exclusively men in different parts of the empire. Very few of us realize how very important the North African church was. The area around what's today Libya and Tunis and so on. Very, very influential in early Christian church.
Yeah.
And the Eastern Church was very different from the Western Church from the outset. And as I said, they had different stories, they had different storytellers. And the gospel, this particular gospel, was written for the church by someone in the church. This man was obviously fairly well educated. He was, I think, Aramaic speaking. He could write Greek. He knew pretty good Greek. Certainly know a lot better Greek than I know. I don't think I would write in a foreign language. We have two people online here who are foreign language experts, but however good you are, it's never quite the same as a native speaker, or rarely the same as a native speaker. It's very difficult to write in a foreign language, and he is writing in Greek, and I think he's Aramaic speaking.
I just, also, one of the things that's always fascinated me is that, going back to your comment that Jesus was exalted after his death, was Jesus never says, your faith in me made you well. All the healing stories are, your faith made you well. Never says, your faith in me. And I always think that's
I'm sorry, I really didn't
Sorry.
understand that.
Jesus never says, when he does his healings, in all three of the Gospels, he doesn't say, your faith in me made you well. He just says, your faith made you well.
Yeah.
So,
And that word, by the way, in Greek, pistis, is the word. It means trust or faith.
right.
And in the context of Jesus' own sayings, if they're authentic, it probably means trust in God. And by the time the church is reading it, it probably means faith in Jesus as the Messiah.
Except that they left it in there as
Yeah.
faith, which that's always fascinated me quite a bit.
That's one example of a
Yeah.
word that covers several meanings, at least those two meanings,
Yeah.
trust and faith, and yet has very different meanings. Let me turn, we were talking earlier about, Paul said this was according to the scriptures, this was according to the scriptures. He doesn't identify the scriptures. Look at Hosea 6:2, if you can find that.
Thank you.
Okay,
Say hello to everybody.
Hosea 6:2 in the Old Testament. I'll read it. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, that we may live before him. That's the only, according to the scriptures, passage that Paul could have possibly have had in mind. There's nothing else in the entire Old Testament that suggests anything like resurrection on the third day. And this passage doesn't even suggest that. What the early church did after Jesus' death, so it appears, is they tried to understand what had happened. I think it's safe to say that Jesus had no idea what was happening when he arrived in Jerusalem, and certainly his disciples had no idea what was happening when they arrived in Jerusalem. What is it that prompted his death? Hard to say. I think the best answer is the turning off the tables of the money changers in the temple, which was an act of sacrilege that the priesthood and the Sadducees would not have liked. And they're the ones who basically conspire against Jesus and do him in. Judas may have been disillusioned. We don't know really why. He didn't do it for the money, because the money is a reward after he does it. It turns out in the gospel. He didn't do it for the money. He was disillusioned, or things were not unfolding the way he expected it to, and who knows? We really don't know. But the fact that Judas did betray him, this seems very likely. It's an improbable story that the church would have created.
Although there are some of the other Gospels that say that Judas didn't betray him. Some of the other Gospels that never became part of the Bible do say that Judas, never say that Judas betrayed him.
There is a Gospel of Judas Iscariot among those Gospels, yeah. And what value those other Gospels have, 16 or 18 or 20 Gospels, depending. See, some of them we don't have, we know only about them. Some of them we actually have the text recently discovered in many cases. And they tell us a lot about the early church. And they tell us very much about the diversity that existed within the early church. And the early church was not one. They disagreed on many issues. In fact, that's why councils are called very early on. And of course, the famous Council of Nicaea, where the doctrine of the Trinity is developed. That's 325.
Good question.
Yes,
May I ask you another question?
please, yeah.
Okay. My understanding is there's some archaeological evidence that just brought out or whatever about Pontius Pilate. And like he's like, it's a brutal person. Like he crucified Jews left and right without trial. They found it in Egypt. And there, like my understanding is there's some biblical scholars said that all this business was about the crown of Pilate and he didn't really do it. They say it's highly questionable that really happened. Like, you know, it was like Jerusalem at Passover is like a tinderbox, and it was like troublemaker, crucify him, get out of the way quick before the trouble started. Is that the new knowledge now?
It's very difficult to know why Jesus was crucified. The people who seem to have been most offended were the Jews. And it was that temple incident. Plus, he questioned the authority of the Pharisees, the Sadducees. He was asked what was the greatest commandment. He says to love God and love one another. I think that's basically one commandment for Jesus. To love God is to love one another. To love one another is to love God. He told the people, they could eat whatever food they wanted. He was breaking all of the laws. That was an offense to authority. And the Pharisees represented penultimate authority, and the Sadducees in Jerusalem, as well as the priests. And Jesus comes in, and he's a troublemaker. He's a troublemaker. But the Jews did not have the power of execution.
Ah.
The Jews could not kill Jesus. And crucifixion was, of course, a Roman form of execution. And what happened? Well, we don't really know. But I think a likely reconstruction of this would be to say the Jews went to the Romans and said, this man is a threat to Roman authority.
The Jews or the religious establishment?
The authorities in Jerusalem. When I say the Jews, I'm sorry. The Pharisees, the Baptists say to Jesus, I shouldn't be baptizing you. You're the one who should be baptizing me. That's a kind of theological advancement. Jesus went down, apparently, to be baptized by John the Baptist. John the Baptist, it appears from what little information we have, was preaching the imminent coming of the end of history as we know it and the arrival of the kingdom of God, the rule of God. And that, in some circles, was something that would be brought about by the arrival of someone called the Son of Man. I think, following the death, the murder of John the Baptist, I think Jesus kind of stepped in and took over. The fact that John the Baptist proclaimed Jesus and his followers and so forth, it's not true. The Baptist movement lasted until the 4th century. And if John told everybody to follow Jesus, as it suggests in the gospel, there wouldn't be Baptists around into the period of the 4th century. But again, reconstructing the history is difficult. I'm doing the best I can within the limits of historical reason, but I cannot tell you that my reconstruction matches what actually happened. That's self-evident. That's not simply my modesty. That's self-evident. We do our best to try to draw reasonable conclusions based on the evidence. I spend 270 pages trying to make my case based on the limited source of the earliest gospel. I like to think I'm, just because I've written the book, one of them, maybe a dozen, really people who have really dissected the Gospel of Mark and know what's in it, going out and doing the whole rest of what needs to be done by looking at Paul, by looking at the other Gospels. That is the work that I, as a New Testament scholar, was trained to do, to learn the languages, to learn Greek, to learn Hebrew, to learn Aramaic and Syriac and Coptic and all of that, so we can read these things firsthand. It's a challenge, and we don't all agree. We don't all agree on the conclusions, but we draw our conclusions as best as we can. Yeah.
Aren't there still some churches or synagogues or whatever in the Middle East that have John the Baptist as their leader? I thought there's still a few left in some places. Is that true?
Churches that have what? The remains
John
of...
Baptist is their spiritual leader or whatever, in the Middle East. I think aren't there a few still left around?
There may be some in Syria. There may be some in Syria. There are some very early Christian denominations that still survive, or did. I don't know what's going on in Syria now. That may all be gone. But there were some very early sects of Christians in Syria.
But you mean that they are, in a sense, churches of John the Baptist,
Yes,
so that
yes,
he
that-
is
the Baptists.
the core figure of the religion?
Yeah. I think there may be, and I'm talking about small, I'm talking about 100 or 200 people.
Yeah.
But I think elements of that have survived. And as I said, that makes one realize that the gospel where John the Baptist basically is proclaiming Jesus, I think that's tacked onto the story. That's where this gospel begins. But look by the way, since we were talking about when Jesus was elevated to become Messiah and Son of God, this gospel is very interesting. Basically, what happens at the baptism?
No, it's my old one and it's not, it's my old one and it's not working well.
John was baptizing, appeared in the wilderness, blah,
Where are
blah,
you?
blah. In chapter 1,
What chapter?
says there's one coming after me, who's more powerful. I think he's really not talking about Jesus, he's talking about the Son of Man. And it happened in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth, verse 9, of Galilee, and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And immediately going up out of the water, he saw the heavens breaking open and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. In you I take delight." This, for the author of the Gospel of the Gospel of Mark, seems to be the time when Jesus is, we call it adoptionist theology, adopted as God's Son in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke obviously trace it back to his birth. The Gospel of John traces it back to the beginnings of the universe. In the beginning was the Logos. They're all different theologies, and basically what we see is we move generally from a simpler to a more elaborate theology. And the Gospel of John virtually has no historical value whatsoever. It's a piece of theological genius, but it has basically no historical value. Is that saying something critical? No. It's a story to try to advance what the church came to believe. That God has the ultimate victory in this effort to destroy someone that the church calls his son. Well, Mark thinks his adopted son at the baptism. Paul suggests, or passage Acts suggests he became son after his resurrection, or by virtue of his resurrection. It's not the timetable that matters. The differences are very interesting, and each one is trying to say something different as the theology becomes more ingrained in the church. And these views grew up in different churches. And believe me, it was not easy for the universal church, whatever that means, to come to agreement on these issues. The fights were bitter in the 2nd century, bitter. And people were called heretics. They weren't heretics. They had a different view of it. They understood it a little bit differently. I mean, they argued at the council whether the Holy Spirit was descended from the Father and the Son, or only from the Father. Who would have known what that meant anyway? And they fought over that, and they excommunicated one another over that. The Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the other churches believed that the Holy Spirit originated only from the Father, not from the Father and the Son, which is the position of the Western Church. It's storytelling anyway. Does somebody believe that something happened? That the Holy Spirit was kind of generated from the Father and the Son?
When did the death penalty come to be for heresy? At what point could these people who disagreed declare each other heretics and actually bring about the death of the people they were condemning?
It's beginning around 325 when the Emperor Constantine, now remember Constantine eventually became a Christian, and he used the church to try to, or to help unify his empire. Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. Constantine presided over the Council of Nicaea. Constantine ultimately decided the formula for the Trinity, because the Alexandrian Church and the Roman Church were in total disagreement. It was the king, it was the Roman emperor, and then he goes about in making Christianity the official religion of the empire. He goes about, getting rid of people who were doing the earlier worships. This was as much political as it was religious. I don't think he knew the difference between Alexandrian and the issue, the big issue at that council was whether Jesus was of the same substance or of similar substance with God. This is ancient Greek philosophy they're playing with.
Still arguing about those things.
That was the argument. The same substance or similar substance.
They're still arguing.
And Arianism was that Jesus was basically Jesus was like God, but not God. And the Nicene formula basically says that Jesus was was part of the Godhead. I think that's interesting historically. I don't know what it means today.
Oh,
Is that really what the church is about, whether Jesus is of the same substance as the Father? Yeah.
Still arguing about it, though, Arthur. Churches are still arguing about it.
Yeah.
Well, I would say maybe not churches, but Christians still arguing.
And some different churches.
Yeah, you'll hear different
competing.
things coming from.
I think the real challenge for Christianity today, if it is to survive, and of course I have another book called The Future of Christianity, Can It Survive, is what in Christianity reflects what are eternal truths about humanity, and what does it reflect reflects the way in which people spoke in the 1st century AD or the 4th century AD or the 12th century AD, whether you're reading Aquinas or Augustine or who you're reading, these great philosophers in their day, but I don't think that they speak to us as meaningfully as they spoke to their own generation. And I think even in looking at a gospel like Mark, we have to say what in it reflects what tells us is the real meaning of human existence. And I think what Jesus said, it doesn't matter what food you eat. It doesn't matter what you drink. It's about whether you love one another. And the Good Samaritan, which is one of my favorite parables, probably was not written by Jesus himself, but the church constructed stories around things that were the teaching of Jesus. When there's this man lying by the roadside who's half dying and whatever, and everybody comes and the priest's passing by and the Sadducees passing by, and some other Samaritan. The Samaritans were from the north, they were the enemies.
Yeah, outcasts, weren't they, in a way?
Outcasts. That would be like, the difference between a black and a white person today, I mean, in parts of this country. And the black man is the one who comes along and takes him, puts him in a hotel and pays the bills and so forth and so on. I think that, to me, that's the timeless component of Christianity.
I would also say that when you look at these stories, these are still the stories of mankind, humankind. We're still behaving the same way as they were, 1,000, 3,000 years ago. We're still having the same arguments. We're still, and we just, and Jesus was kind of countercultural. He came and said, this is, he walked into Jerusalem without a sword, without a chariot, with barefoot disciples and they called him king and laid down their cloaks. And I think that's the powerful story behind these.
I come out of
As a minister, I feel they still do speak to us.
I come out of a German school that Rudolf Bultmann is kind of the father of, that said that it's time for us not to look at the Bible and interpret it theologically as if it tells us something about God, but we need to interpret it or begin to interpret it anthropologically, that basically what it's about is humankind, and who are we, and what is it that we need to do to give meaning to life, if there is any meaning to life. Or Bultmann goes on and says, or even better yet, existentially, does it address the question in a meaningful way of what is the meaning of human existence? And I think that's the kind of question that Christians should be talking about and trying to understand.
Your point about the Good Samaritan story being written by someone else in a later construct.
It's only in the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah, okay. So about when? Would it be?
That was
when
probably written sometime around 85 or 90. Now written, whether the story was...
The story emerged.
But that's
well, that's an interesting take on this, because with the commandment, love God and love one another, which is really a single commandment. Well, what does that mean? Well, the story, the Good Samaritan story, really says, what is your duty to your fellow human being, especially if he's lying there bleeding in the ditch.
And whether Jesus said it or whether someone in the church made it is irrelevant.
It is irrelevant.
It's irrelevant. The question is, because the New Testament is a body in which this is some way contained, and what is it, as I said, what is it that's timely, that reflects Palestine in the 1st century, and what is it that's timeless? And that's a game. I'm not a theologian, but to me that's the game that the theologians should be playing, and people in the church. Barbara and I have these conversations all the time.
I would also
when did Peter how did Peter see Jesus? Well, I suspect he may have seen him in a dream. You know, Islam has something like this. Muhammad, one night, he goes to bed, and he takes a night trip to Jerusalem. Well, Muhammad was never in Jerusalem.
It's a dream.
It was probably a dream. But dreams were meaningful to people in antiquity in ways in which they are not today. I
It's a
don't
way
think
of
we
being
still understand what
transported.
dreams
It's a
are.
way of being transported.
They actually reflected something that happened to you during the night. And if that's where Peter first saw him, I don't know. Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, verse whatever. Where are my glasses? And to me, this is a very important passage. And it's usually mistranslated. In chapter 1, verse 16, I'll back up to 15. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me, this is Paul speaking, called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son, it says here, to me. But the Greek says, and I just checked the Jerusalem Bible before I came, God chose to reveal his Son in me.
Which chapter
or
are you in? here?
Within me. What?
Which chapter?
This is chapter 1, verse 15, 16.
Okay.
And I think what we're talking about in the case of Paul's conversion is an inward experience. God chose to reveal his resurrected Son within me. That's the kind of thing a lot of evangelical Christians speak about today, that the Spirit or Christ or something lives in them. I think it reflects the nature of religious experience. The stories about the road to Damascus, Paul sees Christ on the road to Damascus, chapters 9, 22, and 26 in the book of Acts, 3 totally different stories. They contradict one another. That's the story you know, and it's compacted, but there are 3 different versions, just as there are different resurrection stories, just as there are different birth narratives.
Genesis stories.
They enrich one
Yeah,
another.
2 Genesis stories,
Genesis
exactly.
They enrich one another.
Yeah.
And to me, it makes religion more relevant if you can make it relevant. If it meaningfully addresses questions and doesn't require you to believe that Jesus could walk on water.
I would say though, in seminary now, we learn what you were teaching 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, that's how we're taught now.
I'll tell you a story that's,
And
this
that's in
is,
seminary, there are
yeah.
still biblical Bible schools that would take a different, very different interpretation from, sometimes when I talk with somebody who attended a Bible school, I say, are we reading the same Bible? Because they see
Not
something so
really.
completely
Not
different
really,
in there than
no.
what I see. But in seminaries and mainline seminaries,
Yeah.
what Arthur is talking about is what is being taught.
Mhm.
And it's
Yeah.
I think very exciting. I think it makes the meaning much richer, much deeper, much more profound and relevant for us, because it is how we've been behaving.
I agree. And of course,
3,000 years.
a lot of my courses that I took were at Harvard Divinity School,
Yeah.
even though I was in the graduate school. Richard Kunkler, who was minister of this church a long time ago, when the 2 churches were unified actually and the United Ministry was created, had me speak on occasions like this many times. And he said to me, you can say this, I can't.
Yeah.
And he knew it. He agreed with me on most of these things. He said, if I say these things in church, they'll drive me out of the church. And he said, but I want them to hear it. And as you said, in the best of our seminaries, in the mainstream, I'm not talking about the evangelicals, in mainstream Christianity, what I'm saying today, you could agree or disagree, but we're talking about details. The method is the same, the perspective is the same, what we're looking at is very much the same. Even in Roman Catholic circles, believe me, there are some Roman Catholic priest scholars who don't believe in the resurrection as a physical event, but really in the kind of language that I was expressing today.
Do they publicly say that, or they just kind of?
They write it in books, they write it in books.
No,
They write it in books,
they haven't.
and they get away with it, and I think.
Do they just camouflage the, how they're saying it though? I'm sorry, but I'm somewhat cynical when it comes to, you know, if you go against Roman Catholic Church authority, especially when it comes to anything sexual, it's like,
Yeah, well, again, it
come down like a ton of bricks.
As I said, there are some first-class Roman Catholic scholars. A lot of this, of course, comes out of the Protestant Church. Most of the people who started this, the form criticism, whatever, they were, in Germany, of course, Lutheran ministers. They were ministers, and they got away with it.
Yeah.
And but some of their works were published posthumously. Some of them were removed from their jobs. Some were executed.
It was pretty brutal.
Biblical study did not come cheap and was not easy. It's been around for
Dangerous.
about 250 years,
Dangerous.
but those first generations suffered far more than people would today. Today you can get away with it about a bit more. Interestingly, when I spoke at the Rothko Chapel in Ithaca years ago on what became my book, The Future of Christianity, Can It Survive? A man came up to me afterwards, and it turned out he was the Turkish ambassador to the United States.
Wow.
And he said, what you've said today should be said also of Islam. He said, because I think everything that you've said is critical, basically, that religion can't be frozen. Religion. It changed from the 1st to the 2nd century, to the 5th century, to the 12th century.
To the
It has to
14th
keep
century.
growing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it loses its voice. I don't think today that we believe in miracles the way in which people did 2,000 years ago. And I don't think it matters whether Jesus could walk on water or not.
It always provides a way of explaining something that you can't find another explanation
It was a way of
for.
saying this man was more than a man. He was a visionary who understood things that we did not understand and don't always understand even today. And I think when you begin to have conversations like that, it becomes much more meaningful than trying to defend a creed that was adopted by the Roman emperor in 325
Yeah,
AD.
Constantine.
For political purposes.
Yes, for certain.
You know, I saw a really interesting movie once on Constantine, and the symbol of the cross and the symbol of the sword, and how very similar they are.
That's why medieval warriors would plant their
Really
swords with the hilts up
interesting.
and bow before it and say a prayer. May I please get through this battle?
Yeah.
I'd be willing to hear any of you. I've been preaching here for the last 15 or 20 minutes, and I don't mind people disagreeing with me too. You know, I don't have a monopoly on truth, but I think what we should be involved in is the quest for truth and trying better to understand the nature of human existence and whether it has any meaning, and if it does, you know, what does it mean? That to me is the struggle. But I'd welcome, we have people here who've been talking, you can't hear them probably.
Probably not. But we can hear.
We can hear you. Yeah. I've shut them all up.
I think it's harder by Zoom sometimes.
Yeah. Anyway, well, we probably are at our end, unless other people have questions or comments they want
Do
to
you have any
make.
more?
Well, yeah, I have two. First of all, Thomas. Didn't the scholars say the Gospel of of it matches the other gospels?
There were two Gospels of Thomas. One is an infancy Gospel of Thomas, but you're talking about another Gospel, which is the Sayings Gospel of Thomas. It was discovered at Nag Hammadi, and it is largely a sayings tradition, and it is very much like the theoretical document that we call Q, that was apparently used by the authors of Luke and Matthew in addition to the Gospel of Mark. It's fairly mainstream. It's got some Gnostic qualities to it, but it's become very, very important. Absolutely.
Now,
Again, not canonized. It's not part of the canon, but for the scholar, that makes no difference. We're trying to reconstruct ancient history. We don't discriminate between the canonical and the non-canonical books because they didn't make the grade. If we want to understand the diversity of Christianity, we have to look at all of this literature.
okay, there's this woman, Chris. Oh, go ahead.
Yes?
I have a question that goes back to the very beginning of your talk when you said that there were 4,500 copies of, was that specific to the Gospel of Mark? I
No,
can't remember.
of New Testament material.
And so is that an unusual amount of material, or is that typical? Were there other kinds of writings that were also being copied at that same rate and surviving, as many copies surviving?
Nothing was copied at that same rate in that period, in that early period. Nothing. You have to realize copying the Bible, just the New Testament, this was done on either parchment, which was animal skin, that had to be, God, how you put this together, or not, or papyrus, and then letter by letter by letter copying this one at a time was an extraordinary exercise, but it was one that was carried on after Constantine at a very high rate. Nothing ever was copied at this rate in antiquity.
So, but the earliest copies, far before Constantine, that's an unusual amount of writing.
Even that's an unusual amount. And of course, one of the things we need to say is we only have what we have.
I can say that too.
And a lot of these
What
4,500
was
things had to be
lost or
fragments, just
destroyed
something a little.
They had to put
or
them
didn't
together.
survive,
Yeah.
We know these were valued, really.
Yeah.
What we know is that these were
Yeah,
valued.
yeah. And yet, every scribe made changes. Sometimes they would correct something, but sometimes they would up the theological element. A good example is the first verse of the Gospel of Mark. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Son of God. Someone decided to add that phrase, others copied it, and before you knew it, it became the
Canonical.
mainstream.
Well, they also left out a lot of stories of the women. The women were probably much more influential. And as time went on, the scribes kind of
Yeah,
wrote them out of the stories. Because in the early Paul writings, there were women who traveled with him. And then they were eventually
yeah.
written out.
And women were less likely to be literate
Talking
for
about
the
the
most
role of
part.
women in the
Yeah.
early church down
Well,
to.
they weren't the scribes, but they were. But they were
There
disciples.
were women who were actually leaders of the church. Now,
Yeah.
what that meant was they met in someone's house.
Oh.
The person who was the leader, and sometimes the word episkopos, the word bishop, is assigned. That's not bishop the way we understand bishop today. It's that person was the leader of that church,
That group, that little
that
cell.
little group. How big were these churches? 20 people? 10 people? They met in people's homes.
2 or 3.
What?
Wherever
2 or 3.
Did you have another question too?
Well, one more if you.
They met in people's homes. They probably began to have something like a liturgy. They celebrated the Lord's Supper. And if you read my book, you'll see that the story of the crucifixion and death of Jesus is built entirely on Old Testament passages. Taken out of context, you pick a passage and you put it here and you put it there, the words of Jesus, all of that comes right out of the Old Testament. An evangelical Christian will tell you, oh, it's the fulfillment of prophecy. It's not the fulfillment of prophecy, it's the prophecy after the event. They read meaning into older texts. A very good example, and I checked the Jerusalem Bible today, which is an authorized Roman Catholic translation, Isaiah 7:14. And you probably know it as saying, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. That's not what the Hebrew says at all. But the church didn't use the Hebrew Bible. The church was using a Greek translation of the Bible, and the original Hebrew, when Isaiah is speaking to the king, Ahaz, behold, a young woman is pregnant and is about to bear a son, and you're going to call his name Emmanuel. He's probably talking about the king's wife. He was not talking about an event 700 years down the road. But that mistranslation of the Hebrew word alma, which means young woman, into Greek, in the Greek translation as Parthenos, was virgin. And the author of the Gospel of Matthew picks up that verse and says, this is fulfillment of Isaiah 7, doesn't say, of Isaiah 7:14, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. That's what they did. And the early church, already by Paul's time, because he says according to the scriptures, but he doesn't say which scriptures. He doesn't really know yet, I think. But they began to read through the Hebrew Bible in Greek, the translation, into Greek, and find any and every single fraction of a verse that they could that would help them better understand what had happened.
As though it all had to be predictive. You have to find the predictions. You have to unearth them.
That's what they.
You have to mine.
And the reason they had to find this is because there was a lot of beliefs about Messiah in Israel. There was not one single belief. There was belief in a political Messiah. There was belief in the coming of the eschatological Son of Man. There were people who didn't believe in a Messiah at all. But there was no group within Judaism in the first century that believed in a suffering Messiah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yes.
And they had to go and they found passages in Isaiah 50 and chapters 50 to 52, the so-called second Isaiah, which gave them the basis for trying to understand and make sense of Jesus' death. God intended this. These are these passages. It's not a reference to Jesus. Go back and read those chapters. They're not a reference to Jesus. But the church appropriated that. And they were not alone. The Essenes did that. It was part of the Jewish theology of the period to go back and find scriptures that were being fulfilled in this day and age.
Were you going to ask another question? I'm afraid
We had
we
one more
kind of
question.
talked over you.
Well,
I still have everybody on the screen here. It's amazing you have.
Don't want to take, take all the time, but, okay, I listened to this on the radio a few weeks ago. This woman in England, Britain, she's Roman Catholic, but she's doing research, and she says all these persecutions by the Romans, the early church, it wasn't as bad as they say. It was really after Christianity became legal. That persecutions became, but it was like the Christians, like the authority, the official church persecuting people that didn't follow the line, supposedly. There was these
Constantine.
months.
We're talking about persecution of
Yeah.
Christians. The first formal persecution of Christians was in 249. There were others that were local early, but systematic. But it was not persecution of Christians. It was persecution of anyone who did not worship the Roman gods, including the emperor. So that included everybody. From the Christian point of view, of course, they were concerned about the persecution of Christians. But with the conversion of the emperor in 325, then the Christians began the
And
persecution
they were the
of the
persecutors.
pagans.
Of others,
Yeah.
of others who didn't accept that new authority, or
Right.
the Emperor's
And
authority.
as I said, I don't know that it was Christianity per se, but it was certainly the emperor. Christianity was his vehicle for strengthening and uniting his own emperorship. The country was very divided. The empire was very
Validating his
divided.
authority.
And he was trying to create unity throughout the empire. And he saw in Christianity a vehicle. He was, by the way, baptized on his deathbed. He was not a Christian before that. He used Christianity. I think maybe it's time. I don't have any rush, but I think I've bored you long enough. And
Not at all.
thank you all for being here.
Well, we'll continue with the conversation too, if people are interested, I'm sure. Did you have any other questions? Those of you in cyberspace?
Well, I will be very interested to see your books. And the whole history of Christianity and how people can relate to it today is conversations that we have, especially with our younger people and even our own children, you know, who've grown up and, you know, they're trying to make sense of all of it. So it's, you know, it's good conversations to have, and I really appreciated some of the things that you said.
What I like is, I of course don't design the cover, but my book was called The Building Blocks of the Earliest Gospel, and I'm talk about how he put the bits and pieces together, and I thought it was kind of fun because the cover shows a kind of building blocks to build a building, so I very much like the cover.
Yeah,
I didn't know what it was going to look like until the book was published. This is my most recent book. But if you know my name, all of this is available on Amazon and, you know, wherever else.
Would you prefer that we get it from you and not go through Amazon?
I don't have extra copies of this to sell. I do have some copies of my New Testament, but I only have, I think, 2 of
Okay.
these. Yeah, and there are discounts too you can get. So I think this is like about $30 though. Yeah, nothing's cheap.
Can we get signed copies?
If you get a copy, I'd be very happy to sign it, definitely.
Good excuse to take a trip to Aurora.
Exactly.
Very definitely. Or Bob, if you order and Bob orders 10 books, you know, you guys have to figure that out. I don't do book
We
sales.
could maybe do some at the church or something.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, also some other books that are they're easy to read too are Marcus Borg books. If anybody's interested also. They're not quite as scholarly as Arthur's, but they really talk about Jesus in a different, you know, very relevant way.
The thing about-
From this book, when you gave your talk at the library.
It had just been
about
published.
Matthew,
It
right?
had just been
That
marked.
was-
Yes. This book is designed for this audience. This is not written for scholars. The scholarly books, you have to be able to read Greek, you know, do this, that, and the other thing. I try to represent the best of scholarship, at least as I understand it, but my audience is laypersons, educated laypersons who are interested. I occasionally throw in a Greek word or something if it's important, and I say pistis can mean trust or faith and explain what that means, but I don't do the kind of analysis that one would do if my audience was people with PhDs in the New Testament. As I said, this is my audience.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Arthur.
Yeah,
We are
thank you,
very
Arthur.
lucky to have somebody of his stature living in our community, so I'm really appreciative that he joined us today, and we look forward maybe to some more to come.
Okay,
People
thank
are
you very much,
interested.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Can I
you,
use my
Arthur.
mask?
Thank you very much.
I thought I had a mask.
You have,
We'll talk later.
Bye-bye.
Great to be back in class.
And no test.
That's
no
right.
You
quiz.
don't have to take a test afterward,
Spencer says it's supposed to be about.
so,
Okay.
all right,
Thank you for
we'll
coming.
see you all.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Bye-bye. I did record it,
I
I
saw you
believe.
taking notes.
So
I
it'll be
was,
on our
actually.
YouTube page for anybody who wants to see it again.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you for your
Thank
question.
you for coming and, yeah.
There's too many of them.
No,
I was just-
you've been here for other things.
Just
I know.
about,
I know
almost
who-
died, almost died. Just on the end of the red, so we timed that perfectly. And it should be, Arthur, I got most of it on video,
Oh, okay.
so I'm gonna put it on the YouTube, our
That's
YouTube
the
page.
weekly testimony.
Okay. Now,
And just to show you, this is a little book. The footnotes tell you all the textual variants that we have from all the manuscripts. And this is a record of all of these manuscripts. The most important ones, as I said, are 4,500. These are the most important. But here, you know, you read the Greek and then you have to read all of this because it tells you, as I gave the example, that Jesus is the son of the carpenter and of Mary.
Now this is one you wrote?
Yes.
Okay, building
My
blocks.
name is here.
Okay, fine. Well, I like to listen, I enjoy listening to you, I'm not so sure I agree with everything you say, but they've got, I watched this on 60 Minutes. This is a year ago, I was in a conversation, talking with the people I was listening to it, but they found out that some guy was able, those, during Pompeii, everything got covered with ash and all that.
Right.
They found a library there, and there was these, tubes covered with dirt or whatever, and they're scrolls, and some guy discovered a way to x-ray it and translate it somehow, And I heard, this is a couple of years ago, frankly, the Bible study, the church I used to go to, that they're finding out that there's still some scrolls from the Dead Sea, supposedly, that they're gonna try to do that with them, supposedly, just to try to understand it, because were made with copper, and then they're because they're so brittle. And I was wondering if you heard anything.
Oh, yeah, they discover things new almost every decade. Some
Yeah.
big discoveries. Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, is one of the most important.